The topic of discussion for this week is a little dark, I think is probably the best way to describe it. If you noticed in your textbook, there on page 348, the book talks about how the Jews were slaughtered while the Crusaders were on their way to defend the Holy Land. And on the one hand, I was actually kind of impressed that the book doesn't shy away from this piece of history, because a lot of books do. A lot of history books and whatnot, they kind of skirt the anti-Semitism of medieval Europe. But we can't ignore it. It exists. It is there. It is apparent. But at the same time, what I'm going to say is going to go beyond the text a little bit, because while mentioning that, the Jews were slaughtered in Worms and Mainz and Cologne, we can say, yeah, they were slaughtered, but why? Really getting at the depth of the nature of anti-Semitism is kind of a difficult task. The truth is, though, we cannot address this issue without looking at it first theologically. And the reason that is because until the Christian religion, there was no real distinction between those of the Judeo-Christian faith. I mean, there were Jews, and then in the early church, we had Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. And then as the course of history, went, we find Rome appropriating, under Theodosius and Constantine, they appropriate the Christian religion, and it becomes the national religion of the Roman Empire, and it becomes a very distinctly Gentile manifestation, where it basically the study of the theology, where we find the letters of the Apostle Paul being written to Gentile Christians who were told to forsake the things of the law because they do not do anything for your salvation. You don't have to be Jewish. Just, you don't have to be circumcised. Awkward topic, but all the things that Jews find to be sacred to their belief system, the Apostle Paul says to the Gentiles, you don't have to do that. And so there was this kind of tension. And if you read Paul's letters, it may seem as if he is anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. But really he was making a distinction between the kind of Christians that could exist in the faith. Some were Jewish, some were Gentile, basically saying to the Gentiles, you don't have to be Jewish in order to be a Christian. But Paul himself was openly very proud of his Judaism. In fact, he even has Timothy circumcised in order to go and reach the Jews, because his mother was Jewish, and so that rite would have been appropriate for him to have accomplished in order to have a voice and a standing to tell the Jews about Christ. But however, Titus, another book in the Bible, he also forbade Titus to get circumcised because he was a Gentile through and through. So, I know there's a lot of interesting surrounding matter, but let me get to the heart of things. The early church took the view that the Jews were evil, that they were God killers. And the word we have for God killing is deicide, just as you would say suicide is to kill oneself and to homicide is to kill another person. Deicide, deity being the root, side meaning murder, as it does in those other examples. It demonstrates deicide is killing God. And so the Jews began to be associated with Judas. And the history of the early church began to take a very strong position against the Jews that they had murdered Christ. And now, of course, when you read the scriptures, if you've ever been familiar with them at all, the story does show that the Jews were aggressively opposed. The specific Jews in question, the ones on the Sanhedrin, the ones in Jerusalem, they were against this one claiming to be equal with God, against this one claiming to be the Christ, and they did their part in playing a hand in his execution. However, I do have to emphasize that Rome held absolute power and authority to execute, and the Jews did not. So, while they may have been implicit in the whole thing, they weren't the trigger pullers. They weren't the gunmen, so to speak. They didn't have that kind of authority. And historically, it would have actually been wrong for them to execute someone. That it would have been wrong. They wouldn't have. So, and if you remember the way the story goes, Christ doesn't stay dead. He does rise from the grave according to the tradition. So, if he had anything negative to say about his own people, definitely wasn't expressed by wrath and judgment against them. In fact, the early Christians were predominantly Jewish. They were a Jewish sect. So this idea that the Jews murdered God became the predominant view. And there were many early church fathers who had quite a bit to say. And so, again, the reason that I'm saying all this is because this explains the kind of trajectory, the foundation that just hurled, the much of Christianity into this dark, anti-Semitic, murderous, violent, movement. And again, and I'm not saying all this because I'm trying to speak against, Christianity. That's not at all my point at all by saying this, but we have to look at the history for what the history was. And while it may be easy to think how treacherous these, early Christians and these medieval, European Christians were, one has to ask themselves what they would do. How would I behave in the same scenario? I would like to think that I would behave better, but again, it's hard to say that. And so, at the same time, we're not going to say, well, they didn't do anything wrong, because they did. Hatred of any form is wrong. Anti-Semitism is wrong. Racism is wrong. Hating another person to the point of murder is wrong. That's actually a Christian teaching. So, in hindsight, one looks back, and it's hard to say what one might actually do in that situation or that scenario. But I will admit they made mistakes, and they were wrong, terribly wrong. And so by learning the history, hopefully we can, as George Santayana is famous for quoting, that if we know the past, we are not doomed to repeat, the mistakes of the past, or something to that effect. So hopefully that we can learn from the mistakes as people, as humans, not just as Christians, but as human beings, to learn the mistakes and the fallacy of the thinking, and hope that we don't see that repeat itself ever. One famous theologian, Justin Martyr, he actually declared that the Jews should rightly suffer, for they have slain the just one. And so the thought that the Jews suffering this persecution and this abuse, even throughout the early church, well into all the way up to the time of Hitler, there was this idea, and also let me be honest, that anti-Semitism still exists today. It has not gone away. In fact, it's probably one of the oldest and most long-lasting hatreds we can observe in thought and culture. But Justin Martyr said they were right to suffer. Interestingly, though, to label the Jews as Christ killers is kind of a difficult thing to to grapple with if you believe, if one was to look at the theology that there is a divine purpose, that really it's Christ was this suffering servant, this lamb who took away the sin of the world, who was crushed and bruised for the transgressions of the people. If that's the concept there, then how could the Jews be considered murderers? Wouldn't they have been participants in the salvation of the world? But the belief was that only those that were truly evil would reject the one who came to save the world from their sins, and so they got labeled as, devils. They got associated with the devil. In fact, there's a really interesting scholarly work by a gentleman named Joshua Trachtenberg, I think is his name, Thatchenberg, I can't remember. But he has a book called The Devil and the Jews, and he points out how through artwork and all of these engravings and all this imagery throughout the Middle Ages, that Jews were associated with the devil. In fact, the kind of the picture we have of the red horned devil with the pitchfork and the tail and the big nose was really an adaptation, taken from the characterization of Jews. And so there you go. So many would argue that the picture of the devil is really just a caricature of a Jew from the Middle Ages. Interesting. But for one, I can see, at least in the line of theological thinking, why many would miss this importance of the kind of satisfaction theory of atonement. Anselm of Canterbury, who lived in 1033 to 1109, in that time period, he wrote a book called Cur Deus Homo, which was literally in English, Why the God Man. And in this book, he, for the first time, outlines and details this idea that Christ died as a suffering satisfaction, like to go die for the sins of the people. Well, that may seem like a very common concept in Western Christianity today, that Jesus died for your sins. Actually wasn't a very common belief in the early church. The early church fathers tend to hold a ransom view of the atonement, where Christ dies and goes to hell and takes the keys to death and hell and tricks the devil and pulls a fast one and sneaks out and ransoms mankind from the grip of the devil. That's not really very biblical. If you've ever read the Bible, that's not really in there. So then, Anselm comes along and he develops this satisfaction theory of the atonement, where he says that, God's honor was offended and his dignity, the only way it could be, restored was that he sacrificed Jesus, that Jesus die in the place of mankind who had offended the honor and dignity of God by sinning. And this is the beginning of the development of this. And over the course of, the 1,000 years that follow, this idea, this theology is very much so developed, especially in the Reformation with Luther and Calvin. But just to name some more, early church fathers that had anti-Semitic thoughts and writings, Hippolytus in 170 to 236, somewhere around there he lived. He maintained that the Jews will forever receive God's just punishment for having murdered Jesus. Origen of Alexandria agreed with this remark. The covenant of Abraham, as it was thought, was superseded. And Cyprian in 200 to 258, when he lived, he insisted that because the children of Abraham would fasten Christ to the cross, because they did that, the covenant with the Jews was replaced by the Christian covenant. However, there's two views to that. Some would say that there's a continuation where the newest covenant, the Christian covenant, while it may be considered better, it's not that it replaced. And so many would call that replacement theology, to say that, the contract was rendered null and void because there was a new contract that was given to the Christians, and now the Jews have been written off. There's definitely an argument to be made for that, but at the same time, if you look in the book of Revelation, you see that there are Jews at the judgment. So either those are believing Jews or those are the Jews in general. Either way, it's not very clear. But just to keep it here historically, let's see. Augustine of Hippo was the most influential Christian theologian probably ever. Augustine, and then following Augustine would be Aquinas. These guys were famous for their theology. But he wrote this. He said, "The Jews held him, the Jews insulted him." This is what he's saying about Christ. "The Jews bound him, they crowned him with thorns, dishonored him by spitting upon him, they scourged him, they heaped abuses upon him, they hung him upon a tree, they pierced him with a lance." Now, that's problematic since they didn't really hang him on the tree. That would have been the Romans, and the piercing with the lance, that would have been definitely the Romans. So who killed Jesus? The Jews and the Gentiles. As I've heard it said, we're the Romans, in the story. We're the Jews in the story. We're Peter. We're Judas. That's the point of the story. I mean, that no one is without some responsibility or culpability or blame in the story, that anyone can find the right identity. So anyway, just to say Augustine here, I think he stretches the truth a little bit to say they hung him on a tree and they pierced him with a lance. So well into the time of the Crusades, Pope Innocent III proclaimed that the blood of Jesus Christ calls out against the Jews and condemns them like Cain to forever wander the face of the earth. Thomas Aquinas, as I had mentioned a second ago, he held a similar view. He said it would be illicit to hold Jews because of their crime of deicide in perpetual servitude. So in his view, he didn't think that they should be forever, held in this place for their crime, but they were guilty nonetheless. So whatever reforms we would have maybe hoped could have taken place in the Protestant Reformation, which we talk about in here towards the end of the course, the deicide charge was not one of the things that Martin Luther wanted to reform. In fact, he said they would crucify 10 more messiahs and kill God himself if it were possible. That was Luther's view. Interestingly, Luther also has a text that he wrote called "On the Jews and Their Lies," which was written in the 1500s. And in that text, he encourages that the Jews their synagogues be burned, that their books and their Torah and their Talmud be destroyed, and that they be cast away to some deserted island. Interestingly enough, Hitler took Luther up on his charge and actually accomplished everything that Luther said should be done. Hitler did accomplish. In fact, his writing from the 1500s on the Jews and their lies found its way into circulation under the Third Reich, under Hitler. There was a reprinting, a resurgence of popularity with that text. In fact, even some of the anti-Semitic things going on in the world in the last 10, 20, 30 years with the, there's a lot of Islamic anti-Semitism towards Jews, and many of the extremists, emphasize the extremists in Islam, reprinted this text of Luther's to kind of show their position, that they don't like the Jews. Call it what it is. It is what it is. John Calvin, also a reformer, who lived 1509 to 1564, believed that the Jews were collectively guilty of deicide, murder of God. If the crucifixion was a necessary part of the divine plan, it was also necessary to the predetermined fate of a demonic, irredeemable Jewry. This is the idea. Deicide was to become the sin not only projected upon the Jews, but ascribed to their demonic essence. So they killed God because they were evil. That was kind of the running thought. Indeed, the Jews refused salvation in Christ, because they failed, as it were, to recognize Christ as the Messiah, but precisely because they do not recognize him as such is what makes him evil, and that's why they would murder him. Let's see. Gregory of Nyssa, another church father, in 335 to 395, he was a vocal proponent of the deicide charge as well. Also taught that the Jews are confederates of the devil, quote, offspring of vipers, utterly vile, enemies of all that is good. Jerome, who is the translator of the Bible into Latin, which was the standard of biblical translation for the Catholic Church until the Reformation. Well, at least for the Catholic Church, they maintained the Latin translations well into the modern era. Jerome asserted that the Jews come from the synagogue of Satan, and that's a phrase that's tossed around a lot in anti-Semitic theological thought, saying that if you call it, the synagogue, a brothel, a den of vice, the devil's refuge, Satan's fortress, a place to deprave the soul, an abyss of every conceivable disaster or whatever you will, you are still saying less than it deserves. So Jerome did not pull any punches in his hatred. So following the Middle Ages, Luther also wrote a book called Von Shem Hemphoras, which in 1543 was, he wrote that the God of the Jews is the devil. As the ones whose father is the devil, the Jews are the antithesis of the ones whose father is God. This is the thought. As the embodiment of the Antichrist, they must necessarily reject Christ. Their contempt for the self-evident truth makes them not only contemptible, but the quintessential enemies of truth, capital T, the children of the father of lies. Here, hatred of the Jews is no longer the unfortunate outcome of the new dispensation, or even the result of social or economic circumstances. Now it is a religious duty incumbent upon pious Christians, something holy and pleasing to God, that to punish them becomes the part of the practice of the religion in the Middle Ages. Ephraim of Syria added Jew hatred to his Christian liturgy in the 300s. Eusebius of Alexandria in the 400s systematically incited hatred against Jews. Athanasius of Constantinople in 1230 to 1310 asserted it is the duty of Christians to hate the deicidal Jews. During the First and Second Crusades, in fact, the belief that, this one's interesting, anyone that kills a Jew will have their sins forgiven, resulting in the massacres of 1096 in Speyer, Worms, Mainz, Cologne, as well as Metz, Thiers, Rouen, and Monnier. So these, the book leaves out most of those. They mention some of them in your textbook, which will give them some credit for bringing up the most known, but there were many more cities where all the Jews were actually murdered during the Crusades. So it's interesting because this idea that a Jew can wash away your sins, it becomes this kind of perverted twisting of the sacrificial rite of atonement. The Jews take the place of Jesus somehow, and their blood, not his, washes away all sin. I mean, that's really kind of interesting. So, placed in such a position, the Jews are placed outside the circle of salvation. The one whose blood brings you redemption is not subject to redemption. So somehow they can't be saved, but their blood could save these crusaders. If they were to kill a Jew, their spilled blood somehow brought salvation from one that in their eyes was irredeemable as a god killer, whose father was Satan. Doesn't make very much sense at all. If you think about it. So, situating these Jews outside of the circle of salvation constitutes a new but inevitable move in their demonization. So, during the recruiting efforts of the Second Crusade in 1146, mobs stirred up by the frenzy of a new crusade attacked local Jewish communities in France and Germany, even as the leading cleric of the day, Bernard Clairvaux, he denounced such violence, but praised the intentions of the rioters. Bernard of Clairvaux was one of the few early Christians in this time of this during the Crusades that spoke out and said that, killing Jews is ridiculous, it's wrong, don't do it. So during the preparations for the Third Crusade in 1188, a near riot was averted in Mainz only because of the swift action taken by officers of Emperor Frederick I and local bishops. In 1189 and 1190, there were more riots and killings throughout England, the most notorious being in York, where local barons were heavily in debt to Jews and took advantage of the widespread attacks to rid themselves of both their debts and their creditors. There were renewed persecutions also in western France in 1236, at the time that another crusade was being preached, and as late as 1320, the massacres of the Second so-called Shepherd's Crusade claimed they were exacting vengeance for the crucifixion, as they forced baptism on Jews over large parts of southern France. All the major crusading expeditions to the east were accompanied by anti-Jewish violence. But deicide is one thing. Blood libel is another accusation that is brought against the Jews. And so part of what you will find here in this week, in this folder below, you'll see some information. One is a video from the United States Holocaust Memorial, and they'll give you a brief history. It kind of covers some of the things that I've touched on here and a little bit more, but that'll give you an idea of kind of the history of anti-Semitism. Then there's some articles that are also here that you'll see. One is as an entry from an encyclopedia by Norman Roth, and it deals with what blood libel is. Blood libel is something that most people in America have never heard of, but in Europe this is a common belief that Jews drink the blood of Christian children, that they steal the blood of Christian children and they mix it into their matzah and they use it during Passover feasts. However, there has never been any proof ever that any Jew has ever taken the blood of anyone. For one, detailed in their religious belief system is to never eat the blood of any animal, much less a human. In fact, if you look at the story of Christ in John 66, I think it's John, when Jesus is going to Jerusalem and he stands up. It may not be John, but it's somewhere, and I know it's the 66th chapter, so maybe that is John. Anyway, it could be Matthew, but don't quote me. Jesus stands up and he says, if you want to come after me, drink my blood and eat my flesh. And it says many of his disciples stopped following him at that point. And the reason why that metaphor, that kind of terminology was wrong for the Jews. They said, this is tough. There's no way, we don't drink blood. We don't eat, the flesh of humans. That's crazy. And of course, he had an allegorical meaning that the blood represented, the wine. It's symbolic, and the flesh was not his flesh, but the bread but the reason that would have been so offensive to the Jews of the day, or any Jew of any era, is because they don't touch the blood. They pour it out. Even in the sacrifices, the blood is like spilled at the side of the altar. any of that. Anyway, all this to say, you'll see actually that there. I mean, there's a lot of cases, and you'll see in the article there, the little excerpt, where there's been these charges throughout the history of Europe, where it was believed that Jews were drinking blood of Christians, and there actually found its way onto American soil an accusation in New York in the early 1900s. There was even before that, just around not too long before that, but in Kiev, I think in Ukraine, there was an actual guy who went to trial over this, accused of blood libel. So I would say enjoy, but there's not. There's not a lot to enjoy, and I recognize that the heaviness of all this, and hopefully that you learn something about a form of hatred that still prevails to this day. That was the underlying motivation for how so many Jews could die during the Holocaust, because the reason was that they were thought to be these monstrous, God-killing, blood-drinking sons of the devil, and it made it very easy for either people to participate in the destruction of the Jews during World War II, or to look the other way and to not take interest, to shut oneself off and think, not concerned with them, because really we all know they are evil. That was the thought. And it made it very possible for what happens in the Crusades that your book mentions to take place. It makes it very possible for what happens in the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, from England and from other parts of Europe throughout the history of Europe. It made it easy to reject these people in a predominantly Christian civilization, to see them as something lesser, something demonized. And so hopefully we can learn from the mistakes of the past and not repeat them. So work your way through the material this week. There's also some lighter-hearted things from your textbook that goes into some depth with Hildegard von Bingen. There's a movie there you'll watch, and then the excerpt the video of the story of Beowulf, and then there's an accompanying questionnaire as well. So I will close this lecture for now. Please, if you can, learn from this and do all that you can to help your brother and sister in the world, and not be implicit in the event that another Holocaust could potentially take place. And keep in mind that was only 80 years ago. So I mean, it wasn't that long ago. That may seem long to us, but in the scale of eternity, that's not a very long time. So I will cut you loose and let you complete the rest of the work in this folder for the week.